Welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyke, the CEO of Urban Green, coming to you from Studio Urban Green in Lower Manhattan. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a net zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we'll have live Q&A in just a bit. Before we start, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is Carrier. Carrier has done so much for the green building movement and for Urban Green. We appreciate their sponsorship today. Now, today we're going to go back to school to learn all the innovative things New York City is doing to green our schools. My guest is Jeremy Shannon. He's the Director of Sustainable Design and Resiliency at the New York City School Construction Authority. Jeremy, welcome to Urban Green Live.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate talking about schools.
Yeah, I'm excited you're here, and I'm really excited you're here because you're our first in-studio guest for any Urban Green Live program, so we're glad that you came in today.
Thanks.
Let's start, Jeremy, tell us the role of the School Construction Authority. I think people are sometimes confused on what the SCA does versus what's the role of the Department of Education. Like, how do those two roles differ when it comes to buildings?
Sure. Yeah, so the School Construction Authority was created about 31 years ago now, and it was separated out from Department of Education. And it really focuses, its mandate is on building new buildings and making sure that we modernize the old buildings. There are 1,500 existing schools, roughly, that our mandate is to modernize and keep ongoing operations. And so that effort is different than what the Department of Education, through their Division of School Facilities, does, which they operate and maintain the buildings through their custodial staff and engineering staff, and make sure that the day-to-day operations are running well.
Got it. So the School Construction Authority does new construction, major renovations. Department of Education maintains and operates the schools. That's the way it works?
And okay. Something I didn't realize when I started working for them about 5 years ago is that we build about 10 to 12 new schools every year.
Wow.
Which is an enormous amount of new schools, about 1 million square feet of new school.
That's amazing. Yeah. So that leads into my next question. How big is your mandate? You just talked about how many new schools that you do, but how many buildings do you touch? What's the renovation cycle like?
Yeah, so in order to do that many new schools, we're actually have a budget of about $4 to $5 billion a year. And
billion with a B?
Billion, right? That's billion.
Yep. Okay.
And so, in addition to those new schools, we're also going into hundreds of existing buildings every year, doing things like roof replacements, HVAC upgrades, facade improvements, and also the things that are near and dear to us of energy improvements and carbon reduction measures.
So we'll get into those in a second, but I'm curious just to know, what is the decision criteria to build a new school? Is it you're replacing one? Is it a net new school into the system?
Yeah, we rarely have the opportunity to replace a school. It's almost always the mandate of actually expanding the school seats and the school needs in the city. Mm-hmm. So, over the last decade, there have been, 800 some thousand, you guys can fact check that later, but around 800 some thousand new people moving into the city, mm-hmm. with a lot of kids. And so with the 1.1 to 1.2 million students that the public schools have to house, our new schools deal with overcrowding on existing schools, but also just neighborhoods growing.
Mm-hmm. And like one last question on scale. So repeat for me again the amount of square footage you cover, and can you kind of try to put that in perspective, like, where that stands in the city of New York from a footprint standpoint?
Yeah, so there are about 150 million square feet of public schooling, and so that's in that roughly 1,500 school buildings. And so when we're actually looking at it from an energy and carbon standpoint, as well as footprint standpoint, we actually have about the carbon that is being used in our schools is almost 1% of the entire carbon emissions for the entire city. Mm-hmm. It's that large.
That's a big footprint. Yeah. So let's talk about all the cool things you guys have been doing. You've done a lot when it comes to electrification. I'm really excited to kind of unpack that today, to help lead the transition away from fossil fuels. So tell us what you've done so far from an electrification standpoint in the school system.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a lot. So let me try and kind of divide it into a couple different camps. But first, I would say that the city itself has been an amazing driver of the sort of innovation and research that the SCA has been doing. For over a decade, as you well know, the kind of the benchmarking that's been established, and then the mandates on first energy and now focusing on carbon have really helped focus city-owned buildings, including the SCA's portfolio, to actually work towards doing more research and updating our standards. So we have, in terms of electrification, we've tried to step into how to electrify, because when we're talking about electrification, well, obviously our cooling is already electrified, and we have everything else in the building of LED lighting and other things like that are already electrified. But we're really looking at focusing on the heating, our kitchen loads, and our hot water systems. And so really trying to break that apart and step through has been our process to how we get there. But I'd say before we even get to the work that we're doing on electrification, since 2007, we've been focused on doing the Green School Guide, which many people haven't cracked that document open, but what it was designed in 2007 to kind of be a lead for building equivalent. At the time in 2007, there wasn't a lead for schools, and so something that was really developed to be New York City specific was developed for the School Construction Authority to use. Since then, as LEED has developed and changed their models, the Green School Guide has also kind of grown. We've had a Green School Guide 2009 version, we've had a Green School Guide 2016 and 2019. And the 2019 version now is what we're currently working under, and that's kind of following V4, LEED V4, and also now adding some V4.1 credits in to try and be equivalent. But beyond that, also, we've taken all of the New York City specific things, like the different local laws, and embedded that into the guide as well. So we have one location there to capture all that.
Right, and so let's talk about that for a second. So the Green School Guide, what would be like the top 2 or 3 challenges in there that you find most difficult implementing as you look at your projects?
Well, I mean, part of it's the breadth of how many different mandates and requirements there are, which is exciting in our situation, but it also can be overwhelming for the designers and who are trying to rapidly design and build these schools. So that's the really helpful part of the Green School Guide, of bringing all that together in one document, and one way of them submitting is how we get through that, as well as we also focus very heavily at SCA on standards and making sure that we have a clear path for designers even before they start the project of what things we want to see in each school.
Right. And so when it comes to decarbonization, is it that guide that is prompting you to take action, or is it some other code or mandate that is guiding how the school thinks about decarbonization?
Yeah. So I'd say that Local Law 97 of 2019 is really that great focus on decarbonization versus energy reduction, which we were all focused on before. And it's not that we're not focused on that at all, but now we just have this other layer that we need to layer on. And so the guide really is trying to keep up with that and maintain that balance, so that as soon as these new regulations come in, we kind of develop the right language for design teams, and then we get it in there so that way they can start learning how they actually apply these new requirements.
Right. And so you've actually built all electric schools, right?
Yeah.
How many have you done?
Well, we have one school, which was the Net Zero School in Staten Island in 2012 was when that was designed, and it was actually operational and occupied in 2015. That school building was really a great prototype for SCA to see how you actually use ground source geothermal and other systems to try and get to an all-electric building. It had solar thermal on the roof and a massive PV array of 2,000 plus panels.
Wow.
That school was really we had a backup gas heating system that was really designed truly as a backup. It wasn't supplemental. And so that was kind of our first foray into an all-electric school. We excitingly have now, and some of this was prompted by the gas moratoriums that happened a couple of years ago, and we started thinking, wow, if this starts happening more often or again, we really need to be ready. So we have about 5 pilots that are, some are finishing design and some are starting in construction now, that have gone all electric.
And so what are you learning from your foray into the all-electric school? Like what has been kind of the hardest thing to do?
Yeah, I think just the when we say an all-electric building, it sounds kind of scary. Like, what does that mean to be an all-electric building, right? But we did start this idea of stepping into it, and a thing that we studied back in 2017, 2018 were domestic hot water. How do we get the domestic hot water system to be off fossil fuel? And originally that study, and it's actually on our website, now you can go and see that study, but originally we had called it the solar thermal study. And then once we started looking into, with our consultant, the other options that were out there, we really started to see, well, actually, the air source heat pump technologies for commercial domestic hot water were really actually ramping up and becoming something that was scalable and worth looking into. And so if you pair that electric air source heat pump with a PV system on the roof, you actually take up less roof square footage than a solar thermal system. It's a lot less moving parts. It's something that's easier for staff to maintain, and it ended up being a cheaper system overall. So that became our standard starting in 2018 for domestic hot water. So that was kind of our, changing minds and kind of this change management process to say, well, let's try this first.
Mm-hmm.
We're not even going to look at the boiler and heating side yet. Let's move into this at a step. And at the same time, there was some pretty good induction technology around kitchens. And we had tried it on the Net Zero School, had a fully induction kitchen, no gas. And the school foods really actually seemed to enjoy that and think it actually operated better than their gas system. So that was an easier thing to then also change our standard and add.
Right. And then what did you do when it came to heat?
Yeah, so the heat is where, so the heat has taken a couple more years to try and tackle that, especially because of, our average public school is anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 square feet. So it's not a small school, not a small building. And so the heat pump technology that really is the high performance heat pump technology that's down in the, once you get down to the design day of 13 degrees, a lot of the commercial heat pump technology for years was kind of tapping out at 40 degrees, and it was starting to have to use electric resistance heating to kind of get the rest. So working with a lot of manufacturers recently, and it actually did start before the pandemic, and this actually shows how productive people have actually been during the pandemic, but we've had multiple new options so that we could have multiple manufacturers, not just one, so it's not a public procurement issue, that have been able to step into the market and say, actually, yeah, we can give you these commercial grade high performance heat pumps that are paired with systems that you're already working with.
Great. I'm going to come back to that, but I want to remind the audience we're going to do live Q&A in just a bit. We're going to use slido.com for that. The code is school, so load your questions there. I see a couple coming in, and we'll get to those in a little bit. So tell me how you work with manufacturers. I mean, you have scale, right? So you can create market demand just based on your footprint. So what's the process like? How do you engage in those conversations?
Yeah, that's been a fun conversation to have, because I came out of the private sector doing design build and kind of passive house and low energy building before I went to SCA. And you call up a manufacturer like Lochinvar or somebody else and say, well, I'm an architect. And I was, it's like, okay, well, they send you to a technician. They don't send you to the people who are doing, the decision making. Here at SCA, well, we say, well, we've got that $4 or $5 billion a year budget. And we don't even have to bring that up, but they know that there's a lot of construction going. And so when we actually get different companies in the room and say, hey, we're thinking of shifting our standard here, if they don't shift with us, then that's a potential loss of a lot of products. So we've had companies like Bilco, who's actually one of our consultants, reached out to Bilco when they were doing some analysis and studies for us. And they asked them if they could design a smoke roof hatch that had a high performance thermally broken frame and assembly, because to date they only had kind of a low R value and there was metal to metal connections, no thermally broken assembly. Within a year, Bilco had designed an R20 thermally broken roof smoke hatch and has it out on the market that anybody can buy right now. And that was prompted by our consultant working with us to develop that.
Right. So guess the big question is, you're learning a lot in the new school space.
Yeah.
How does that translate to the existing schools from a decarbonization standpoint?
Yeah, it's actually surprising how many different things can transfer over from a technology standpoint. A lot of the energy reduction measures, because the first focus that we've had for many years was, well, let's reduce our loads first before we just switch over the fuel, right, and switch over to a different way of powering. So a lot of the energy reduction measures are focused on kind of getting to that near passive house building envelope level, moving those things forward. Most of those can translate to existing buildings. It's obviously a lot more expensive to do those same measures on an existing building when you're switching out a facade versus designing it from scratch. But technologically, it's very similar once you kind of get back down to the bones of the building.
Right. And what do you, like, if, whether it's new construction or in renovation, what is the one obstacle you wish you could overcome to accelerate decarbonization in schools?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we get there's a lot of hesitancy, not at SC, but I think just in the city overall, about where the grid's going to be and how we're going to get there. And so then, even though I think the technology, especially on the commercial level now, is where it needs to be for us to electrify now, existing buildings and new buildings, there's that hesitancy of, well, I don't know where that's going to be. And there was a recent report, 2020, from the New York ISO, focused on, and ISO being kind of the grid utility group that runs the grid,
right?
Focused on kind of how they're planning for the future. And it was exciting to see actually that when we're talking electrification, like we said, like cooling is already electrified. So we're not going to make the summer peak worse by electrifying our schools. What we're doing is we're taking our gas heating system or our oil heating system on old buildings, that sort of thing, and we're converting that to electric. So it's really the winter peak we need to concern ourselves with. We're having these discussions daily at our agency and other agencies, which is kind of amazing how many people are now aware of what a winter peak versus summer peak is, right?
We're all becoming grid literate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that winter peak isn't really projected by that New York ISO to actually happen until 2039 or 2040. So it means we have 20 years that if we electrify now, the grid has time to catch up with us shifting our load to the winter. And then the last point that's very specific to schools and maybe some other building types that was in that report is that the actual daily winter peak is going to hit somewhere around like 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. So when we've been talking internally about schools and our worry if all of a sudden we were able to afford to electrify hundreds of schools all at once, our schools will be done for the day before that winter peak on a daily basis is peaking. So we're actually helping smooth the grid baseline out because we're peaking earlier and allowing the grid to invest and be more efficient that way.
It's good. I can't help myself. This is a great setup for the next Urban Green research report, which is coming out in just a few weeks, called Grid Ready, which is looking at how ready is our grid for electrification, what are the factors we need to think about, and it covers many of the points that Jeremy just mentioned. So thanks for raising those good points. Let's talk about training.
Yeah.
You know, we're in this new world of decarbonization. What do you see as the training needs for the school, but more generally, how can you translate to the marketplace? What are the training gaps that we need to fill?
Right. Well, I think we've had success in the industry by making sure that the industry professionals are ready for the transition first. If owners come to the profession and say, I want to electrify, but the architects and engineers are not knowledgeable about that this is the right time and that the grid is ready for this and that we should move these things forward, then we're not going to have success because they're going to dissuade owners to make those moves. So where we've started at SCA is really we've actually trained over 100 of the SCA staff architects and engineers in the Passive House designer course already, and that's a long 7-day course that they take. And so it's a big commitment, but we're really trying to make it so that it's kind of from the ground up, that your staff knows that high performance design. Even many of those were trained even before we had our first buildings using some of those technologies, those high performance technologies. And we have another 40 staff that's going to be trained this winter on the same technologies. We've now included the tradesperson training as well, so that way we're getting the construction management and project management people integrated. Additionally, beyond our staff, we're then focusing and saying in our standards and specs that our general contractors and their project managers have to have at least 40 hours of high performance building equivalent training. And we don't get specific on what that training is, but when they ask questions about would something be match, the point is just trying to raise that conversation and let them know right from the bidding document, this is something that we prioritize. So that's kind of our internal side, and the other side is, what does the industry need? And I think, the industry needs an enormous amount more bodies. Yeah, and I think it's not just a matter of more bodies, but more of an emphasis on the skills, and that it's actually a trade and a craft, and not just a contractor. And I think that mindset, we have a great opportunity with schools if we can start to actually get to the students in the high school years and instill in them that this is a desirable profession to be a tradesperson. That's where we're looking at 2050. So 30 years, all those high school students are going to give us a lot of excellent trade work if we can encourage them to get into that.
That's a great point. You may have the best place to influence the future labor market by pointing out these opportunities. And that's terrific that you have this baseline of training and as your requirements. Do you think, from your experience, the market knows enough about heat pumps for it to become as mainstream as we're going to need over the next years and decades?
I would say I'm confident enough now that it's the right time to switch to heat pumps based on the technology that's out there. But I think many other people, I'm very hopeful that the refrigerant issues are going to be resolved in the near term in terms of coming up with even lower, carbon emission type refrigerants. And I think there's a lot more room. I don't think we've hit the floor yet on efficiency of heat pumps yet. So I think that we're going to see a lot more development in that over the next 5 to 10 years. But a lot of times that R&D will happen if owners and portfolio builders like SCA and others continue to push and demand better products and lower performing, in terms of, that we don't want just to perform really well at 13 degrees Fahrenheit. We want to perform at 0 degrees Fahrenheit just as well and have really high COPs. So,
and in the hot water space, let's go back to that. Do you think we're at scale now for what you need, at least from a school perspective?
Yeah, and it's actually, there's some pretty easy sort of plug and play opportunities for that. That's even scalable for large buildings. For the schools, we have 2 different options where we can either do the packaged air source heat pump that's indoors and that's on top of a water storage tank. Like multiple manufacturers have that now, 120 gallon storage tanks. And if we have a school that needs a couple of those, we can put those in parallel with each other and do that. If we have a larger school, like a high school or something else that you wouldn't want to put 5 of those in parallel because of the size of the school, we can just move to some of the outdoor split air source heat pump opportunities. Many companies have these now where we've got the outdoor unit and the indoor unit is then just paired with water storage tanks of the size that you need. So it's relatively low maintenance and easy to install systems.
And what do you think is your top 1, 2, 3 decarbonization opportunities in existing schools?
Well, we have a couple hundred number 4 oil boiler schools remaining. With the mandate of getting number 6 oil out of schools, that was all done and successful and done actually couple years ahead of the plan on that. And we've been very successful in eliminating a lot of the number 4 oil schools. There were hundreds of them. And so we're down to just under a couple hundred left. And so there are some really good opportunities to electrify those where it makes sense. And some of the things we're looking at for those schools are not only are those boilers in bad shape and need replacement, but are the distribution systems in those schools in bad shape? Are there extra costs to bring gas to that building, and extra concerns about just opening up the streets and doing additional work there? That's a great pitch that we can then say, hey, we need more funding to do an all-electric school here. But knowing that we're not going to have costs available, next year for all 200 of them, we've actually been developing over the last couple of years a really great program of looking at waste biofuel. So 100% waste biofuel. It's not the ethanol, it's not removing, cropland and that sort of thing, because that was one of our criteria. But it's actually doing from the rendering of meat factories and, the discarded corn cobs from agribusiness and that sort of thing. It's turning that into actually diesel grade biofuel, and we're converting our number 4 oil boilers to use that. Right now, the UL listing only allows us to do biofuel at 20% mixed with number 2 oil, and we're hoping that the UL listing for B100 will be available within 1 or 2 years, and we can just switch over to using the same equipment.
Great. We'll get to the audience questions in just a bit. There's a lot of them coming in, so keep them coming. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about indoor air quality. It's a big topic these days. Tell us how you approach IAQ strategies when you're looking at new construction for schools.
Yeah. So for years, we've been doing MERV 13 filtration for the outdoor air. And MERV 8 filtration for recirculating air in the building. And the MERV 13 filters, for those who are not aware of those, the MERV 13 is really what ASHRAE recommends for cleaning and purifying the air. It's expected that really actually can trap most viruses and bacteria, and also particulates coming from outside. So the real focus before COVID was on outside air quality, right? Let's make sure that outside air coming in is good. And we were assuming that the indoor air quality, like everyone else, is good enough, and that's why we do a lower filtration. We've added MERV 13 filtering now to our standards for the indoor air too. So everything being recirculated is at the same level of filtration. Additionally, we've followed ASHRAE recommendations to add a sequence when we're in kind of, pandemic mode of now, to add an extra couple hours before occupancy and a couple hours after occupancy for adding a little bit of extra ventilation to the space. Not a little bit, actually, it's quite a bit of extra outside air to flush out any lingering contaminants that might have been in there.
Great. Yeah. And do you see, how do you see IAQ progressing in the coming years when you think about new construction?
Well, we've also developed and added a couple years ago demand control ventilation with CO2 demand control, and that was a big step forward from occupancy, because it's making sure that when the students and the occupants are there, you're giving them the right amount of airflow, not just dumping air in. So before, we were dumping air in whenever one person walked in the school, and so from an air volume standpoint and air quality standpoint, that's great. But from an energy and carbon standpoint, that's not hitting those targets and those goals that we have. So now we're making sure that we've got a ton of fresh air going in when the building is and rooms are occupied, but we're backing off when they're not occupied with that CO2 ventilation. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that, and I think that there's going to be a push to start tracking that, and that technology is going to continue to develop.
Great. Well, my last question before we get to all the audience questions come in. So Jeremy, what do you want New York City kids to know about your work?
Well, with 3 kids who used to be in the public school system here before we moved out of the city, I want them to realize that we're, every day we're working very hard to see at each school and all the new schools how we can achieve these air quality measures, how we can achieve these sustainability, resiliency, and decarbonization measures. But I also want them to realize that they are full partners with us in this effort. They're the ones occupying the school building. They're the ones that if they start to develop their own or their own sustainability club, and there are actually already many clubs that the great people, Department of Education, have already established sustainability clubs in most schools. Get involved with that, because as they get involved and they learn about taking a waste and turning into a resource, and the recycling and the composting and that sort of thing, they're going to actually help kind of move political support for their school and their area into doing more of this and adding more city funding to all of these things that we're trying to add to their schools. And it's not just reducing the waste, but it's also looking at the school building that they're in and seeing, how can I make this school building better? How can I treat it better? Because I come from a family with 2 public school teachers, and they would always instill in my brother and I that if whenever you're in a place, make it better than when you went into it, right? So I think that that's true sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. So let's jump into the audience questions here. First one actually was a conversation I was hoping we'd get into, and it's the first one. 5 votes. You can upvote your questions on Slido, by the way. So how are you building resiliency into electrification? During storms and other events, schools typically are a shelter for the community. So, what's your view of schools not only serving the community function to educate our kids, but actually to be a community resource in times of extreme heat or storms from a resiliency standpoint for a community?
Yeah, that's a great question. The community is going to naturally gravitate to the school building as a resource. And so I think that for resiliency, one of the big focuses that we're having is on a high performance facade goes a long way for resiliency. So, and all people in the passive house world know this, is that if you have a facade that can take, that has a lot of good insulation, great windows, thermally broken, if the temperature swings drastically outside or it's super cold for a week, you can actually coast through that even without power, and have a manageable interior temperature. So I think those are some of the things that we're trying to bake in for resiliency, as well as we do have on most larger schools backup generation systems, and we're actually doing studies now on how we could use battery storage as potential future backup systems. Mm-hmm. We're not there yet, and so we're still studying that. And right now, actually, we're kind of starting to study how we can use battery storage to do peak shaving as well, and try and help the grid in that sense.
Great. How do New York City schools compare to schools in other cities for reducing emissions?
Well, it's a pretty low bar already, in the sense that when a lot of you are aware of the Local Law 31 of 2016, and that was trying to set certain, half of the benchmark for different buildings, and the schools by and large were already half below all of the other building types in terms of energy consumption. I think it's really about the density of the schools, the size of the schools, and also some of the previous measures that have been put into schools. So I think that it's already a pretty low bar, and we're getting lower. We're trying to get it so that all of our schools are going to be, near net zero.
Mm-hmm. And do you see, this is the largest school system in the country.
Yeah.
So from that vantage point, how do you see other cities or other states approaching this? Is greening schools a national phenomenon, or is it just one that's unique to this area?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's a great community that USGBC has for the green schools community. Their social media where everybody's kind of sharing ideas and passing that stuff along. So definitely New York City is not unique in this. I would say that we, based on the resources we have and then the research and development that we're able to invest in this, I would like to think that we are also helping lead the way in some of these different technologies, but there's a great community that we're learning from all the time also.
Here's a couple questions that kind of get to who do you need to convince? Do you have people that resist you? How do you communicate benefits to parents and the general public? Let's kind of group all those together and what's the natural tension against doing this? I mean, is it budgetary? Is it policy moves? And how do you get across those to communicate the benefits of what you need to do from a decarbonization standpoint, from an IAQ standpoint, to make our schools better?
Right. I mean, if we were in a different city, I would say, that, wow, I just wish that the mandates were there, right? But we've got great mandates already set up for us here. It's just about doing the volume of work that's necessary in my mind. And I feel that over the last couple of years, what I've been excited to find through our research is that the technology is already there. It's ready for us to start implementing. And excitingly, we are implementing those things. So now it's really about, like, how do we scale that when you've got 1,500 buildings and you're constantly building new buildings? How do you get that scaled? So I think that, in my position, we're doing the research, the technology, getting the information out there, and there's been a lot of cooperation and success with the city putting funds together, with the SCA's already kind of alignment on the work that we're already doing and getting a lot of these technologies installed.
Do you see pull for what you do, either from parents or students, to ask, like, how green are our schools, or how can we green our schools?
Well, I mean, we do have kind of a lot of our work is kind of this invisible work, right? So I have had plenty of times where people are like, I wish we were doing something with sustainability in New York, city schools, or, friends of mine that have their kids in different schools, and it's like, people don't see when that scaffolding is up and when they're replacing a facade, or when the new building is going up, how much insulation, and that we work out all the details so the thermal bridges were resolved and those sort of things, that the mechanical systems are super high performing. They don't see those things, right? And so, they see solar panels and some of those other things. And actually, excitingly now, every new school is adding solar panels onto the roof. So it's just, there's so many different things I could mention, but so there are these things that are more visible, but most of our work is, unless we do a section of wall that maybe is clear and we detail it out, most of our work is kind of behind the scenes. You don't really see that sustainability.
Right. And it actually leads nicely to the next question is, do you do these projects while kids are in school, or you do them only in the summer? Like, how could you do that amount of work in just a couple month period?
Yeah. Most of the SCA's work is done after hours, and in summer, there's very little that we do during the school day. But I think a lot of people have the idea that the summer is kind of long, 3 months long. The summer for us is about 6 weeks of work by the time you've got to get the custodians closing things up, and then also getting everything cleaned and ready for the new school year. So we really have to do evening, weekend work on almost all of our projects, which is why, scaffolding can stay up for multiple years, because you're having to fit it in while the building stays occupied. We don't have buildings in New York City to shift everybody to.
Right. There's a question about, like, controls and monitoring. So how do you monitor, schools for performance? Do you have some big dashboard in your office, or how does that work?
Right. It's like one of those police shows that have all the fancy dashboard. No, we have in many hundreds of schools, we have building management systems that are designed. So since 2007 in the Green School Guide, and they've been putting a lot of these BMS systems in. And then in a lot of existing schools, hundreds of them now, Department of Education through the Division of School Facilities has been installing real-time meter in all of those schools. So people are monitoring those. Some fancy, like, double screens, but people are monitoring those and helping track that data to lower the energy, because shaving the loads will probably be half of what we need to do. Not just adding new capital improvements, right? There's a lot of improvement that can be done in just fine tuning what we already have.
Do you have, like, a roadmap? Do you have goal sets for those that you try to push schools towards?
We've been working on a sustainability master plan, kind of getting to 2050 in general, and I know that Division of Citywide Administrative Services has been energy modeling that sort of effort for city-owned buildings, also kind of as this parallel track with Local 97 for private buildings. And so those goals are in the process of being integrated. You know, a lot of the things we're already kind of doing the right measures, but now it's a matter of how do we align those goals with the scale that we have to get to? And that's where I'm pleading with students and everybody else, like, go into the construction profession, because we need more contractors, we need more skilled tradespeople to get all this work done.
Here's a question about how is it decided what school will get upgraded or what district? So what are the criteria for prioritizing, you know, the retrofits that you need to do?
Every year, the school systems, every system in the school gets a rating on its, you know, useful life and quality, and so then that rating, it goes through a very detailed capital planning process, which I'm not in that department, so I can't give you the very specifics of that process. But it's a very rigorous process to try and meet everyone's needs. And while $4 to $5 billion a year sounds like an enormous amount of money, and it is, it's not nearly enough money that's needed to do everything to get every school where it has to go.
Next question here, we talked a little bit about this, is how can the work you're doing help inform the broader market, commercial and multifamily? So, you know, what do you think are the jump points from schools into either commercial or into multifamily, and what you're learning and we can apply across all of New York City?
Yeah. I mean, what I could extrapolate from the work that we've been doing with heat pump technology and all the energy modeling we've been doing is that I think that the grid we have today is ready for high performance heat pumps in commercial buildings today, not just schools, but in many buildings. I've heard it in a lot of different forums. People are still skeptical of that and think that, well, okay, if that works for schools, that's just schools. A school is just a giant commercial building, you know, or small compared to whatever, you know, some of the buildings that we're in, right? But the technologies all still apply. You know, that air source heat pump doesn't care whether the outside air is sitting outside of a school or is sitting outside of a multifamily building. It's still the same efficiency. And so then when you've got the same grid factor, I don't see how that doesn't pencil out the same way. So I think a lot of these things that we're learning is that the time is right now to electrify in schools and other buildings.
Right. Question here is, how does the SCA work with Dcas?
So Division of Citywide Administrative Services is Dcas. And we have a very good relationship working with them on their energy management side. They also work with Department of Education for kind of load management, also some of those things that we're talking about that aren't necessarily needing capital. But we have kind of a weekly working relationship with them to take what the city is requiring and make sure it's matching what the schools are requiring to meet our current mission and also to achieve these decarbonization requirements.
Got it. Where'd that question go? It's a good question here. Here it is. The question is, you know, there have been, and maybe you can bring us up to date on requirements to have every school have cooling.
Right.
So where are we with kind of cooling our schools, and then how do you balance that with the decarbonization that you're trying to face?
Right. Yeah. When we've been modeling the, you know, kind of the track of how much carbon the portfolio has and where it needs to go. So when we add new schools right now, since we're not at net zero, new schools take us in the wrong direction, even though they're very small, based on an existing school from carbon. The same thing with the adding cooling to every classroom. While it's really important for the health of the students and occupants, it is taking us in the wrong direction. So we're trying to find ways to now, as we're doing facade renovations, we have two pilot projects in existing buildings that are kind of, one's in the drawing board now and one's actually hitting construction, that are going all electric. And also one of those has is designing a new passive house facade. that way we're going to be integrating heat pump technology to do the cooling rather than just kind of a window shaker, sitting outside, which many of the classrooms have. As far as I am aware, it's not my department to track that, but it's imminent that within the next year or so, all of those should be finally installed. So every classroom in the city has air conditioning.
The question here, can you talk more about the type of training your team receives and what is most valuable and what would you benefit more from?
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly attending Urban Green events. Shameless plug, but it's
Thank
true.
You.
No, we really, there's so much to learn from all of our colleagues, so we don't stay in our little silo. We get out to we were just the Net Zero conference recently. We do the Passive House conference, the Green Schools conferences that USGBC puts on, and then just read everything we can on electrification, grid, schools. So for us, education is in my department is just a constant effort, because we're not in the drafting and design side. We're in the what's happening in the industry side and how do we apply that to our schools.
Right. There's a question about speaking of training and where the market may be going. Are you looking at carbon sequestration? And where do you see, what role do you see that playing in schools going forward?
Yeah, carbon sequestration as well as embodied carbon are two things that are currently in our R&D, basically. We have baked into the Green School Guide, which is also part of LEED, the life cycle assessment for embodied carbon. So we do that in our integrated design process for every school right now, every new building. We do not currently, and the city doesn't currently have any mandates around embodied carbon. So we're definitely working to educate staff on what that even means, how we track it. So it's almost like we're at the benchmarking stage of trying to understand where we are. So as soon as these kind of city mandates, and often they push out for city buildings first before the private sector. So as soon as they're ready for that, because I know they're itching to get some of those things out, we'll be ready to start implementing those reductions.
Right. And sequestration, do you see you getting into that?
I mean, we're definitely looking at the carbon capture in concrete and other things like that. I think that is, while it's good technology and it's not that much extra cost, it's still kind of a little bit of a drop in the bucket. So the things that we're really doing right now is trying to say, well, we can sequester carbon in this concrete here, but if we're designing a precast panel, does it really need to be 6 inches thick? Could it be 5 inches thick? Right. So then it gives back to the embodied carbon and sequestration, or there should be that constant designer's, holistic view of wherever you can reduce, and wherever you can sequester or add some of these films that also absorb carbon. These are great technologies that I think have a real future. Some of them are at the early stage where we don't necessarily have a lot of producers. And so as a private procurement process, we have to have at least 2, usually 3 or more, to implement those technologies.
And then on the embodied carbon piece, what I hear a lot from people is, I just wish there were clear standards. Like, show me the directory where I can go buy these products. So talk to us about, the standards, where they are, where you think that needs to go for that market to evolve. Yeah,
I mean, in terms of, we require the consultants in our documentation to use Athena or equivalent programs, which then already have kind of baked in metrics for different building materials. But I'm not just plugging that one. I'm sure there are tons of great other options. That's just the one that we wanted to standardize in that realm. But I would agree. I think that there definitely needs to be a lot more work in that area. I think we, as an industry, started in the right place, because one of the things that you look at from the building's life cycle is that usually the energy used in our schools and in many buildings is 8 to 10 times higher over that lifetime than the embodied carbon of that same building. Especially
say that again.
Yeah. So the embodied carbon is important, but the energy used in the building is about 8 to 10 times higher than the embodied carbon. So we're currently in the right direction, and now as we're getting so good in terms of knowing what to do, now we just need to implement on the energy use. Now we can start to turn our focus to the embodied carbon and remove that as well.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's interesting how that, and that's in a point in time, right? So for a new school, you open it, the embodied carbon will be at its highest point there.
Right. And we build schools for 100 years. So it's...
Right. So each year, each day that you go beyond that, the operational carbon starts to eclipse. But clearly, we need both and the balance. It's interesting to see that you're pursuing that. Is there a plan to use school roofs for solar PV?
Yes. So yeah, I should have said that more in the main thing, but Local Law 94 of 2019 was a great push to kind of make it a mandate for us and everybody else in the city to put solar on the roofs, solar or a green roof, because of the city's 100 megawatt for city-owned building push that's been out there for maybe a decade now. We want to help that out as much as possible by prioritizing PV first, and then where PVs don't make sense, then we look to green roofs. And we're currently, there's some new requirements with kind of stormwater management, some other things coming out this coming year that we're keeping an eye on. And we're currently doing some research and development on how we can maybe look to solar and a canopy system rather than the current ballast system that we're designing, so that we could have green roof underneath of that, which would also be recharging the rainwater system at the same time we're absorbing solar for energy. So we don't want to just do one or the other. We want to see if there's a way to integrate that.
Right. A couple questions related to COVID, as you can imagine. So I guess we group them all in. How has COVID changed the way you think about school design?
Well, I mean, COVID's had plenty of horrible repercussions. I'd say one of the silver linings out of it would be that we are focused more as a society on air quality. I think most people think if they're comfortable, the air quality is good, right? So the temperature's right, so it must be good quality, right? So I think that there's been a change in perception of that has helped us in the sustainability resiliency industry start actually deploying more HEPA filtration and other types of systems that you just see as standard, which would have taken, I'd say, another decade to really get this mainstream. So it has helped in that sense really move that more rapidly.
Next question here: is there a way parents and the community can get involved in your work?
I think definitely we're trying to find ways that our work becomes more visible. So maybe we are going to put those wall cavities that you can see. But I think that at the SCA we have so much work to do on the capital side that we're really kind of, our heads are down and we're really trying to focus on that. I'd say that the parents, there's a lot of untapped potential still for parents and kids to continue to get involved with DOE's sustainability program. And they have a great director there and a great program that's already instituting a lot of these educational components. So I think that that's the right place, and we're well connected with them. And so where we can start to come in and educate people about the main systems and the big changes we're doing too, I'd be all for it.
Yeah, sure. And do you see more teachers using the type of activities and strategies that you're using as examples in the classroom? Like, is there real learning opportunities here that can go on?
Yeah, with the net zero school that we did is a good example of, we have a dashboard that anybody can go and look at, and it shows you how much energy is generating, and it gives other kind of fun facts about equivalencies. And I know that it's been baked into that curriculum for that school for those teachers to constantly kind of show, and they do math problems off of that and do other things with that dashboard. So I think that in the future here, what we could be working with the Department of Education sustainability and on is to kind of integrate some of this BMS and other data collection we're getting to try and create that idea of a dashboard more. Right. We do have in the requirements for all the new schools that have solar, they're required in all of the main lobbies now to show the solar generation. So as those are all coming online, kids are going to daily walk in and they're going to say, "Oh, look, the sun's shining and we're generating more power right now." So I think that'll be exciting.
That's great. Regarding your comment about batteries for peak shaving, does that have any direct benefits to the school building in question, or is it just for the grid in general?
A lot of what we're what we try and focus on the sustainable and resiliency side is kind of how do we step into the right technologies, not just for schools, but also for the city and overall for the industry. And this is one of those where our early studies on is it ready? Is the solar battery system or is the battery system ready for being a backup generator? And we found that the cost and kind of the amount of space it would need wasn't there yet. But in order to get us there, we need people buying solar battery, battery power and backup systems and that sort of thing. And there's definitely been a couple recent schools that we're piggybacking off of their knowledge. It's about the knowledge sharing that we're doing the study to say, well, what if we did a smaller system now, just a peak shave? The city is getting good actual cost savings from that energy reduction. And hopefully that starts to add volume to the manufacturing industry that they can then, in the future, we can use that not just for peak shaving, but maybe we can add to that same system at that school and have a battery backup also.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, and I'll pick this one. It's a question about, does the SCA have any initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion and environmental justice? But maybe we could broaden that just to say, what is the role of a school as a physical asset in a community when it comes to DEI and when it comes to environmental justice?
Yeah, we have actually the SCA, I know, has won some awards as being one of the largest. Our MWB program is for contractors is actually one of the largest used programs. And I know they're doing great efforts to increase that. The other thing is that when we're looking at what schools in terms of number 4 boilers to replace, one of the things we're always tracking is it in a zone that has air quality issues, right? Which usually lines up with those EJ issues. So it's definitely something that we do track and we focus on, and so we're adding that layer into the decision making on which schools go first, because when you have that many schools, you always have to have some sort of decision tree, and a lot of them are always needing work. So,
well, great. Well, we're already at the top of our hour, so I want to thank Jeremy Shannon for a really, really informative discussion, and thanks for spending time at Urban Green today.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, appreciate it.
I want to give a shout out again to our sponsor for today's program, to Carrier. Thank you for helping to bring this program to our audience today. Appreciate your support. Thanks for joining us today. See you at the next program.